Yeah. Hi, everyone. I just like to thank Tom, of course, first for inviting me to give this talk. I really appreciate it. And of course, to the rest of the JavaScript Exchange team for like having the event in the first place. A little bit about me. As you know, like my name's Iman, and my journey kind of started with startups right out of college. So we set up this startup called Co in Edinburgh, and that went on for like almost 2 years. In between that, I worked at Accenture for a year in the DevOps department specifically. And now, since the start of this year, I've been a full stack engineer at Pento, loving it. And what we do is kind of automate payroll for small to medium businesses. Initially, it was in the DK market only, but now we've expanded to the UK. But we'll get more into that a bit later. So, kind of like through these experiences, I've sort of had an early, how would you say, like touch with like building things from the ground up. Kind of like just a side effect of working at startups, I guess. So today I want to talk about where Node.js kind of is a good fit in a polyglot architecture. So, like why talk about this at all and why now? So a survey conducted by O'Reilly in 2018 basically asked a lot of software architects if they were using microservices, and half of them, or actually a little bit more than half, said yes, like they were actually using microservices. And as of last year, 73% of developers now know JavaScript, which is actually like a 13% increase from the year before, according to the HackerRank Developer Skills Report. And like this community is just growing really fast, and of course the adoption of microservices is also growing really fast. So yeah, like 1+1 = 2, put these together, it's bound to be that some services in your microservices environment will be using Node.js, which came out in 2009, and it essentially enabled, as I'm sure you're all aware, to use JavaScript on the server side, which was really cool. And then 2 years later, actually in 2011, was the first time microservices, the actual term, was used in an event in Venice. But I didn't want to use microservices in the title itself because like polyglot architecture, basically is trying to say that you don't have to completely stick to the constraints of an actual microservices paradigm. Like essentially, as long as you have services in your backend which run on more than one language, this talk will basically kind of walk you through where Node.js fits in there. But in these environments, of course, it's kind of difficult to always manage them. And if you're a small organization, sometimes you don't want to take on that overhead. But Google open sourced Kubernetes in 2015, which like really changed this, because suddenly you had a system where, after the initial setup, it kind of manages these otherwise, which were called headaches in a microservices architecture, communicating between different services, making sure they're up, scaling them out. And Kubernetes kind of does these things like automatically for you. And you can roll out or automatically roll back your application. And so essentially, like smaller and smaller teams could take the advantages that this architecture provides from an earlier stage. And in fact, in 2016, not even the top 20 languages made 80% of all the code online. And this basically is telling us that more and more engineers almost always know more than one language. They definitely prefer to use the language of choice for whatever the problem they're solving. They don't like to be constrained by their environment. And because of all this, I thought like, where does Node.js fit into this picture? Of course, it provides a lot of benefits, but I don't actually have time to talk about all of them. So I just want to focus on two particular ones, which is kind of like the main things that will affect how we see them in this architecture. The first one is non-blocking IO, and the second is it being JSON native, or treating JSON basically as a first-class citizen. Of course, this isn't a node-specific feature. It's just a side effect of being able to use JavaScript as a server-side language. Um, so we're going to dive deeper into this, and in this like sort of example architecture I've set up, it's just like a dummy, but it sort of is like in parallel with how a real one would be. Um, so you have your clients, your web client, web mobile client, desktop, and on the server side, let's say you have 4 different microservices here, like quite trivial, and they're all connected to their own data store. And you have your users making requests, and let's say one of these operations that they're trying to do requires your clients, whichever it may be, to communicate with more than one microservice on the server side. And like you can just imagine the way it would work is like you make one request to service one, you get the response, then you make another one, and you get that response, and then you put them together, and finally you can render the UI. So this is, as you like, this direct client to microservice communication, is not very performant or efficient, especially if you're using a mobile network. And it also means like your client needs to be aware of the different API contracts each of these services have. So if the underlying service changes, then so you also have to refactor your client. And this is not ideal, right? So in this architecture, usually like you have a gateway layer that kind of solves this problem for you. And Node.js is actually a really good contender in this space to act as your gateway layer, because what it allows you to do is now the client can talk to this layer instead of the services which lie underneath it. And there's only one contract to adhere to for the client now. So, and the gateway layer takes control of the responsibilities of talking to, whatever services it has to basically deliver the result to the client. But Node.js's non-blocking I/O, or asynchronous I/O, basically means that you can do this in a way such that you don't have to wait until the operation completes for it to accept other connections. Like Node.js can receive this request, and then let's say call service one, and then basically queue that event in its event loop, and then move on to receiving other requests from your users, whichever client they may be using. And as you can imagine, this scales really well, because suddenly you no longer need to keep your clients waiting until the operation completes. Sorry, you don't need to keep your gateway layer waiting until your operation completes. It's free to accept more requests. And then once it does have the result, it can relay it back to the client. An additional benefit of having this layer, actually, and this one's not really node specific, but it will be within your VPC. So if you're in your cloud environment, and any network call, especially if you're, let's say, using Google Cloud, their Jupyter network is like extremely fast. It's actually a gigabit bidirectional bandwidth. What that means is it almost as if you have all your services running on the same machine. It's so fast. Whereas if your client was doing this, that would mean that it lives outside your VPC, and every network call you made obviously adds some overhead to the process itself. And some really well-known companies that take advantage of this feature of having Node.js in the gateway layer are like Uber and Netflix. And you don't need me to tell you, they obviously have millions of users using their product, and this ability to scale and efficiently complete their user requests is really important to them. So the question I guess you can ask yourself is like, does our client need to communicate with more than one backend service, and does it need to do this often? In which case, if this is so, like, Node.js is definitely is a contender of to be like the environment of choice to build an intermediate layer. All right. So yeah, so let's say now we have this, and we've added our gateway there, and our application keeps growing. Um, and at some point, it may so happen that you need to provide some real-time services, um, such as notifications or a chat messaging service, or you're handling some kind of streaming data. And this is another great advantage that Node provides because of its non-blocking I/O. Similar to how it can, keep its thread open so as to basically accept more requests, more concurrent requests. It can also do the same while trying to hold the persistent connection that you need to deliver real-time services with the client. And the difference, if you had done this in a different language, is basically that it does it on a single thread. So, the essential fact here is that Node.js's single-threaded event loop is what makes these like really cool, extremely efficient processes possible. In these other languages, you would be using multiple threads to do the same thing, and what that ultimately means is that you're using more compute resources. And on the cloud, obviously, as you scale, if you have thousands and millions, the more compute you use, the more expensive it will be for you. And having these services in Node means that you can use lower compute resources and essentially save quite a bit of money. And in this case, the question to ask yourself is really quite straightforward. Like, does the service need to operate in real time? Then, immediately Node is a good contender in this regard. And finally, I guess you're probably asking yourself, okay, but I don't have a microservices architecture, right? We have a monolith. How does this make sense? So actually, so do we. We run a DK app and a UK app, and they run on our Kubernetes cluster separately. And of course, they have their individual workers as well. But to give you some more context on, what does it actually take to automate payroll? Of course, it means that we calculate your taxes, your pension, your benefits, but also take it a step further. So like Pento wants to do it end to end in a way such that like we automate your payments, we send the pay slips to your employees, we report to HMRC, we report to your pension providers so that you stay compliant, and also sync with your accounting software, which is all really cool, but it's like a lot of integrations. And as a SaaS provider, you anyway have to integrate with some basic ones like Stripe as an example, to provide billing, or you want to have two-factor authentication, so Twilio. But in Pento's case, we have all of this as well. And this, what you see here is just the UK. Like there's an equivalent of each of these for DK as well. By DK, by the way, I mean Denmark. So yeah, this just got me thinking, like, there's so many of these integrations, all with a different set of APIs, and Node.js is JSON native. So that means it treats JSON as a first-class citizen, making it much easier to manipulate JSON data compared to most other languages, especially if they're deeply nested. But this doesn't always apply, right? So like, yes, it is true that Node.js in general is better to manipulate and communicate with APIs. It's kind of sort of what it does best. But for us, these integrations are extremely closely connected to our core product. And we can't really afford any mishaps here, especially not runtime errors uh, because that would mean people won't get paid, or we were the company reports their taxes too late. So it's just like really not something we can afford. Um, However, since joining the company, I've actually worked on quite a few services which are ad hoc to our main application. And these things included things that basically help us save time all around for our customers and for our operations team. So it includes things like importing of large companies, notifying our ops team so that if any critical error does take place in real time, then we can react to it as fast as possible. And one more service, which was actually the one that I was writing in Go. And I realized that it may not have been the best choice. So it was actually this mistake that kind of led to this talk, where, it's not always true just because we use all our other services in a certain language, whatever your domain or product might be, that it's the best choice for your new product or new service that you're trying to do. And the service I'm talking about is called KYB. And what that is if you're aware, with your bank, as an individual, you have to provide your KYC, or it's called Know Your Customer. And it's their way of identifying whether basically identifying you, and whether it's okay for them to take you on as their customer. And so this is just like the business equivalent of that, and it's called Know Your Business, hence KYB. And this service in itself, if you weren't to automate it, the way it would work is, we would have to ask our customers all the information about their business, their directors and beneficial owners, collect their documents, and then submit it to the payment provider that you use. And of course, we want to do better. We want to automate this as much as possible. So a way, if you can imagine, is like your admin on your product would trigger this API, and in turn, you would contact Companies House, which is a body in the UK which has all the registered lists of companies in the UK, and has almost always enough information to get the things we need to submit to our payment provider. So we retrieve this, and then we would build a form in the cases where we don't have enough information still, or we want the customer to verify it. And then after building that form, we would send it to the customer, and then once they submit it, we would have an endpoint that listens on this, and then uploads that to Modular, who's our payment provider. And from there, they would take on everything else to verify them based on the information that we submitted. And while all this is happening, of course, we want to also keep an eye on things in our Slack channels, which we use to communicate primarily. And the easiest way to kind of do that is through Zapier. So as you can see, this relatively small service in itself has 5 integrations. And I started writing this in Go, and the further I went, I suddenly realized, maybe it wasn't the best approach in hindsight. Node.js actually even has some SDKs for Typeform and Zapier, so it would have definitely increased or rather decreased the amount of time in which I could have delivered the service. And it's sort of some of the things you can think about when you're trying to develop a new service, whether you already have a microservices architecture or you're using a monolith. Does your service need to communicate with several third-party APIs? Then immediately Node should be one of the contenders, depending on how loosely or closely coupled it is with your main product. So yeah, where this kind of leaves us is this sort of dummy environment where you can see, depending on your architecture, there are some common things where Node.js uh, fits in quite well. The first being that gateway layer, um, basically allowing you to handle a lot of concurrent connections compared to other languages, and of course real time, and all both of these for that same reason of having non-blocking IO. And finally, integrations. Like if you have these small ad hoc services or even large ones, um, depending on how many or who they talk to, you may already have a library built in npm, which is like Node's package manager. So that would inherently decrease the time it would take you to build it, or even if it doesn't, just the ease of manipulation you have to use JSON data in JavaScript really helps. But there are also some cases where it's not so good, like whether you're trying. So actually, we're trying to build an analytics service right now, and there Node.js doesn't really, or not just Node.js, but JavaScript in general doesn't fit out of the box. Though of course, like you can make a language things, make it do things that it's not necessarily designed to, but like out of the box, doing compute intensive processes which block the single threaded design of Node.js, kind of defeats the purpose. So it's not the best choice. And for that same reason, if you have a service which is reading or writing to disk a lot, it's not great, because even though Node.js actually says it's a feature that now you can use JavaScript to access your disk on your machine, those libraries actually have a lot of calls or methods in their API that cannot be done async. So the moment you use them, you're blocking your thread, and you can't do anything else until those operations complete. So that kind of gives you like a picture of like if you're using microservices, where kind of, or just like an architecture in general that uses more than one language, which is quite common nowadays, and where kind of Node.js would, help you plug in all the pieces together, or where a new service, would really benefit from being written in Node. But needless to say, like these are in no way exhaustive, and every domain and use case are different. Yeah, I can never have a definitive set of rules that will always fit. But the idea or the ultimate goal is, as an organization, how quickly can you iterate reliably and move as fast as possible? And sometimes, you know, uh, Node.js helps you do just that. And I hope that the questions we came up with help you identify those places. And if you want to do some more reading on these, like I've put all the links here. These are some great blogs from all the big companies, Uber, LinkedIn, Netflix, and how they really make the most of Node.js. And the last one, Deno, is actually just really cool because Ryan Dahl, who created Node, actually has been working on this new project called Deno, which looks to address some of the lackings of Node. And it's just a really interesting read. I encourage you to check it out. And finally, with that, I just want to say thank you. Given the current economic climate, I thought it was important for me to say that we're hiring at Pento. We have a great team, really dedicated, and most importantly, a great culture. Our founders, Emil and Jonas, set it up a few years ago and started remote working way before it was cool, way before Corona. So they know how to do it really well. And if you're looking for a new adventure, I can't recommend this enough. And in fact, if your company is looking to automate payroll, then also check this out. So yeah, with that, I just want to say thank you again. And my contact details